function basics, what are the required things? What are the required things in a function when you are writing a function? What is the syntax? What's that? Definition. And what is the definition actually? The definition consists with keyword def and the name that will follow the same naming convention of a variable name, and then the parameter. So if we don't have any parameter, it will be like empty one with parentheses, and then colon. This is like the header of a function. And what will be the body? Body will be the statement that you are going to do, right? Okay. And as I told you, the variables and parameters are local. That means whenever you are using any parameter in the function, they are local. You cannot use that variable outside of that block. The scope of that particular variable is inside the function. You cannot use it outside of this function. And without calling a function, you cannot use that function. Like, you see, if you're not invoking that function, it is like unusable. You can write 100 lines of function, but it will be unusable if you're not calling the function. And how you can call it? Without writing the def, just the function name, and then the argument. If it is like empty parameter, that means you are calling with empty argument. If you're writing some parameters, for example, like 2 parameters to add 2 numbers, then you need to pass 2 argument while you're calling the function. And that should be exactly the same amount, unless it's specified. And they should be in ordered way by default. That means if you're adding A and B, A first, B later, you need to put those 2 values in that order. A value first, B value second when you're calling the function. Okay. Return type, typically function. So whenever you're writing a function, you need to return some production, what you're producing inside a function. If you're not returning, by default, it will return what? None, right? That means even if you're not writing the return statement, the function returns a none value. None means like nothing. But there is a type in Python which is like a none type variable. Okay, so let me go to the reading part here. Okay, one important thing that I missed last class is like stack diagram and the trace backs. What does that mean? Stack diagram is like when there are like multiple function, you are calling. There's an example here probably. Yeah, for example, like this one. I have like 2 functions, greet and make message, right? I'm calling a function greet. So what it does, it just, let me see. Well, yeah. When I'm calling the greet function, it goes to the greet function first. And then inside the greet function, it calls the make message. That means I need to call the make message function from greet function, and whatever it returns, I need to get it and hold it inside the message variable. So that means I have a stack here. First is the make message. I need to call the make message function. Whatever it returns, then I need to work with the next one. Then it returns the value Alex, for example. Then it calls the greet function. So let me run this code in Python tutor so that it makes more sense. Okay. So here's my global frame. I'm just defining the function header. That means I know here's the greet function. Whenever someone calls it, I will invoke that header. And then the make message, those are some locator. I'm calling now greet function. When I'm calling, it calls this locator. So here's my stack. Now this is my stack, function stack. So right now I have 1 function. And what I'm sending Alex. Alex is a argument that I'm sending to greet function. And inside the greet function, there is an argument called like name, which can map this Alex with the name. So Alex actually mapped with the variable name. And this name is a local variable for that greet message. That means I cannot use the name variable outside of the greet function. Though they are like same name, like same variable name and name, but they're two different things. I cannot use the name here. So here's the variable for the greet function. I'm calling make message. In the make message, I'm calling this function. That means I have like two items. You know, the stack, when I'm piling a lot of plates, we are putting one after another, right? That means whenever I'm calling a function, it will call one after another, like a stack. So first I need to execute this function, and then I need to go back to here. Like this is the top of the stack, make function. Though I am in the greet function, but from the greet function, I'm calling make message function. And you can see the name variable, those two the variables are not the same. Though their name are the same name, but they're two different things. You cannot use the name variable, like greets name variable, to the make message function, or the vice versa. You cannot use the name variable from here to there. That means I need to solve this function first. Then I need to call this function. It needs to be returned. Return what? Return some string, hello plus the name. It returns. Whenever it returns, we're done with that function. That means we can remove the plate from the stack. Just removed. So in the stack, there is no make message function. But previously we have like two functions. First greet, then make message. Greet in the bottom, make message in the top. That means I need to solve the make message functionality first, then go back to the bottom one. And whenever there is a return, that means we're done with that function. And we can just remove the plate from the top. That means that we have like one function here, greet. And what you need to do, we have the message. In the message, it returns the value. What it returns? It returns hello Alex. That means there are like a variable. I'm putting the variable message. Inside the message, I'm putting whatever the make message function returns. Now I have name and the message, two variables in the greet function. And the next statement is like printing the message. It just print, and you can see here, since it is printing but not returning, by default it returns none. And when it is returned, that means we're done with that function. We can remove the plate from the stack as well. So there is nothing in the stack. Does that make sense? This is how the function stacks works. When you have like multiple function, 4, 5, 6, if they're nested, like function within a function, then probably you need to follow this stack. And the good way to see those stacks is like Python tutor. You can see the stacks of those functions. Which one you'll call first, which one is called later, which one at the very top of the stack. Does that make sense? Now the related thing is like traceback. Traceback is for like whenever you have an error, probably you need to trace it back where I'm getting the error. So here's my code. Probably there's some error, and I'm calling the greet function. The greet function has a name. It called another function shout. It goes to the shout function. Shout function takes the name as a text, and it returns text.upper. Now I'm trying to call this function greet42. So what can be a problem here? When I'm calling this function, it goes here, name is 42. It goes to shout 42. It calls shout 42 text.upper. So 42 is a text, but it's an integer. You cannot convert in an uppercase, right? That means there is an error. Now we have an error here. So here's my error. So trace back is like going from back. First I'm saying, well, integer object has no attribute upper. What's the issue? Issue is, so starting from here actually, not from there, starting from the top. Line number 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So here. So line number 7, what's the problem? Grid 42. And then what? Line number 5. Line number 5, what? Line number 5 is like grid. Up to this point, it is fine. Shout name. And then in line number 2, it is trying to convert this 42 to upper, and then we're getting an error. This is how you can trace back whenever you have an error. Okay. So this is the same process for the stack. Stack is like you need to track it down, which function needs to be called first, which one later. And trace back is whenever you have an error, you need to trace it back at the same way. Does that make sense? Okay, so return value, conditional, Boolean function, and leap of faith. I missed those things in the last module. Let me go to that module 4. Okay, so as I told you, the return always, like a function always returns something. If it is not, see, if it doesn't have any return statement, by default it returns none. That's why it mentioned like some function have return values, some returns none. For an example, like this one, math.sqrt, which will return the square root of some number, right? It is returning something. Some function, or you may write your own function, for example, like this, repeat the word n time. So it is printing, but not returning. As I told you, whenever you're writing a function, do not print anything inside the function. You can only print for testing purposes. But when it is deliverable code, do not print anything inside the function. For your assignment or the labs, I saw like you use a lot of print statement inside the function, but it is okay for the assignment. But for the project or for the next onward project, do not print anything inside a function. A function's job is to do something. You're giving it some input, it will return you some output and do some processing. That's it. You're not supposed to print anything inside that function. But if you need to trace it back or to see whether your function is working or not, then you can use a print statement. But make sure when you deliver your code, hide those line or comment those line out. Make sense? So this function is printing something, but not returning anything. That means by default, it returns a none. Okay. Okay. So return value and conditionals. I told you, you need to write a return statement in a function, but you could write multiple return statement in a function. How? You may be aware of the conditional. Conditional is like you are going this branch or that branch, and from this branch, you can go to the exit, right? That means I don't need to go to the other branch. For example, like this code, I'm going to check whether the value is less than 0 or not, like a negative number or positive number. If it is a negative number, I'm returning the negative of that number, like positive, like I'm just giving the absolute value of any number. If you're giving me a positive number, I'm just returning that value. If you're giving me a negative number, I'm negating it. That means negating is a positive. I'm just giving you the absolute value. So that's what it's checking. It is checking whether the value is less than 0. That means it is a negative number. I'm returning from here. That means I don't need to execute those 2 lines of code. Even if we have 2 return statement, we're not going there. It's because there are like 2 hands, 2 branches, right? For the if statement, if it is a negative 1, I'm returning from here. That's it. I'm not executing the next 2 lines. If it is a positive, that means I'm not executing this line. Rather, I'm going to the else block, and there I'm just returning the exact same value, right? That means we can write multiple return statement in our code using conditionals. Make sense? Sometimes we need to use some function as a Boolean function. What is the Boolean function? A Boolean function returns true or false, like a Boolean variable. Like, so we can write some function which returns either true or false. Like there will be like two branches. One branch will return true, another branch will return false. For example, I'm checking like is divisibility or whether it's an odd or even number. If it is an odd number, I'm returning true. I can write a function like is odd. That means if it is returning true, that means it is true. It is returning an odd number. Or I can write like if it is not divisible, return false. Like the function name is divisible. So with the name of the function, it is more clear like what we are going to do. Like the function is like is divisible, like whether this particular value is divisible or not. X and Y is divisible or not. So if it is returning true, that means it is divisible. Like if we are putting 10 and 10 here, when you're calling the is divisible, it returns true. When it is 10 or 13, for an example, it is not divisible, but there's some fraction. Instead of returning the fraction, you can return the false. Probably you have used the uh, divide by zero thing. Like when you are dividing by zero, you are returning the error message for the last assignment, right? So what you can do here, I can write some function, for example, like sub and a and b. I can write if a is divisible by 2, or maybe if b is equal 0, return false. That means there is an error, right? Divide by 0 error. Otherwise, you can return true. So instead of divide, I'm just calling this function name is like is divide by 0. This is my function name, is divide by 0. So whenever I'm calling this function is divide by 0, it always return true or false. So what I can do here, I can call this, ouch. So what I can do here, I can call this function is divide by 0, and then I'm passing two numbers like 10 and 12, and I'm checking if the function, that means it returns true or false, right? If it is true, only then I can do the process. What process? The process is like return a divided by b. Otherwise, I can return. So even if we need to print something, we can return a string. So divide by 0, like this. So instead of 10 and 12, I can write a is 10, b is 12. So you can write two variables in this way, a, b is 10, 12. Both are same. So a will refer to 10, b will refer to 12. So what I'm going to do here, I'm calling a and b. Instead of returns, and since it is not a function, so let me call a function here, like dev sub is a function a and b. And inside this function, I'm returning those things. Here is my a and b. And at the very end, I'm calling sub a and b. And whatever the value, the result, I'm going to print it. So what I'm going to do here, I'm calling the sub function first. Sub function first check whether it is divisible by 0 or not. I'm not using try and except here, just checking Boolean function. So I'm calling this function is divide by 0. So it returns true or false. If it is a false, I'm just returning the string divide by 0. Divide by 0 error, for example. If it is not, then I will divide and return the answer. Let me run it. There's some value. If we are changing these things to 0, like b is 0, it will return divide by 0. So this is how we can validate our input instead of using try and except, using a Boolean function to validate those things. Does that make sense? And this type of function also called like leap of faith. Leap of faith means like, I know is like is divided by 0. That means if it is a true, that means it is divided by 0. If it is a false, it is not divisible by 0. So by writing the name, I can just rewrite the name in other way, is not divided by 0. In that case, I'm just changing the so in that case, I need to return the other way actually, and to return this. So here is not divided by 0. That means if it is a true, that means it is not divided by 0. If it is a false, that means not means like it can be divided by 0. Other way, sorry. If it is a true, that means it is divided by 0. If it is a false, it cannot be. That means we can divide A to B. So that's why this type of function naming is called like leap of faith. You can faith those, like you can trust those functions. Is divisible, that means if it is returning true, it is true. I don't need to worry about whatever they're doing inside that function. But I'm just reversing the logic. That's why it is like this way. Sometimes I found some students, they're getting some code from online and they're trying to convert it like this way. It is easy to see like, well, typically we're trying to write this type of leap of faith, like is divisible. You're writing is not divisible, and then you're negating all of those things. That means you're getting some help from somewhere, some resources, and you're trying to modify it by yourself. It is fine, but it takes too much time for you to do those things. Instead, you can rewrite this code. I will show you today how you can rewrite your code, how you can refactor your code. Even if it is a bigger code or maybe a smaller function, you can write two functions inside a function. And let me know, do you understand these things? Okay. So this type of leap of faith type function or Boolean function are useful for input validation. Like for example, you're checking is number is a function. You're checking if it is a number, it returns true. If it is not, it returns false. So for your project or maybe next project, you need to write those type of validation function. Okay. Sometimes we need to know the type of the function. So it's the type checking. We need to check the type of the function. For an example, I'm writing a function which can only work with integer value. If I'm putting the string value there, probably there will be an error. Or maybe I'm so sure that this function is only work with integer, but somehow on your code, you are let me write some code that make more sense, I think. So for an example, I'm writing this code like def, like is divisible, for an example. So what you're doing here, if A, like if B is 0, here's the input. A is input. Enter A. B is another input. Enter B, right? Now, my inputs are what type? A and B are what type? String, right? That means if I'm calling is divide by 0, A and B will have an error there, right? So this is like a convention. Whenever you are sending those two values, you need to convert it to an integer or float, whatever it is. So I'm just converting in maybe float. What is the right way? Now we're all good, right? But maybe some programmer wrote the code in this way, like they are taking these two inputs as a string, then they are converting here. Right? I don't know how they have written the function. I'm assuming that whenever I'm sending those values, they are either integer or float, but somehow the programmer who wrote this code, they thought like, well, A and B like raw input, we can modify, like we can convert those input here inside the function. That means I don't know. I don't know the type they're expecting. That's why there is a function called like isInstance. In using that function, you can check with some values. Like you are sending some type and see whether they're expecting this type of value, this type of variables or parameters. So for an example, I'm just sending this 3 to the integer function. So now you can see isInstance, sorry, there is no underscore. IsInstance is a function to check, which will always return true or false. First parameter is the variable. Second parameter is the function name. You can see here, integer is a function that we have used, right? But here we are not using the parentheses. Whenever we are calling the parent, like writing the parentheses, that means we're calling the function. We're not calling the function. We're checking the function. That means I'm just writing the function name here, the int function. If you're writing your own function, like for example, for our case, is divided by 0, you can put here like is divided by 0. But not function calling. This is function calling. But this is the function header name. So I'm checking the parameter with the function, whether they are the right type. So what is the type? 3, integer, right? And what is the type they're expecting? They're expecting a string type. That means it will return a false ratio. So same thing here, the integer function. If I'm sending 3.5, is the next line, 1.5 to int function, it returns a false. That's because integer function expects a value of integer. But if you're putting 1.5, a float number, it will return a false. So you never know how the programmer wrote this code. Though there's a leap of faith, but you never know what are the type they have declared in the function. So before calling the function, it is better to use the isInstance function to check with your variable type so that you'll not have an error. Or maybe you're getting some error, but you don't have the access of that function, like is divided by 0. Then you can check with the isInstance function, like what are the type they're expecting. Does that make sense? Okay. Now the program structure. So program structure, what is a program structure? So program structure basically we need to organize our functional programming. And what is the functional programming? When you're writing a function. So for your first project, you haven't written any function, right? That is not a functional programming. Whenever writing a function, this is called a functional programming or procedural programming. So when you're writing a functional programming, you need to organize it. So first break those complex tasks in the smaller or logical part, write the cleaner code and find the errors faster, allows code to test and reuse and independently, and make programs more reliable and scalable. What does that mean by scalable? For example, you're writing a function called like add, it can add only 2 numbers. Scalable is like if your function can add multiple numbers, if the user is entering 2 numbers, that can work, 3 numbers, 4 numbers, 1 million numbers, that can work. That is the scalable of your function. Initially, you need to write the very small code for the function, adding 2 numbers, working fine, then make it reusable and scalable. by changing or tweaking something. I'll show you how to do that. But program structure, when you're writing your code, make sure you follow these things. The doc string. What is the doc string? The doc string is the function documentation. Whenever you're writing a function, you need to write some comment or like documentation for that function, what this function is supposed to do. Like your program, your first program, probably you haven't written any comment, but you should write something like, well, you are the author, this is the project one, and this project takes this input will produce this output, not the values, but the like conceptual things, like the so it will take units and what the other things, the crew number as an input, and it will produce top, Mira, and the crew share, right? You can write those things in the very first line of your code so that if you will revisit your code later or someone try to modify your code, they can see what you have written. What is the purpose of writing this code? Now, when you're writing a function, it is very important to write these things. The function documentation, what it is supposed to do, what are the input, what are the output, how it works. For example, like add function, you can write something like this function takes two inputs, operand 1 and operand 2. It will return the addition of two numbers. That means someone can easily see like this function can only add two numbers, right? And how you can write a function documentation, which is called actually doc string. Whenever you're writing documentation for a function, this is basically called a doc string. And how to write a multiple line comment? So commenting, how to write comment in a code, single line commenting, multiple line commenting. Was that? Pound sign for single line, and for the multiple lines, triple quotation, either single quote or double quote. That means whenever you're writing a function, make sure you write something about the function. Now, the good thing of using these things is like whenever you are writing a function, anyone can see the documentation. For example, like int function, someone has written the int function for us, right? For example, I have written the is divided by 0. Here's my documentation. I'm writing it takes two inputs and returns true or false based on the divisibility, right? Divisibility. So here's the doc string of this function. Now, I'm giving this function to you to use, given that this function is working fine. Now, maybe I can write two inputs, two integer inputs, or two string inputs. Now, as you're working with this function, you don't know what to do with this function, but you need to know what are the parameters, what are the type of the parameters, and what it is returning. So to know those things, you can write a function called like help. Inside the help function, if you write the function name, it will return the doc string. You can see the doc string here. The function name and then the doc string. If I'm writing int, the built-in function by Python, it gives me a lot of things. Convert a number to a string to an integer, blah, 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 and a lot of other things. That means they have written that much of things inside the int function as a doc string. That means it is really important when you're writing a function, make sure you write the doc string, right? And same thing for your program. Whenever you're writing a program, make sure you write at least few things. What are those things? Like I would like to write a program. And who's the programmer? I'm the author, right? So I can write I'm the author. so that no one can claim that it is their work. What is the date? And for what reason? Probably it's like in class illustration. And what I'm going to do here, I can write something like, well, this program do these things. Like for your project, you can write some more information like, well, this is project 2, you're the author, here's your date, and what your project is supposed to do, takes 3 inputs and then returns encoded or decoded message, given that the alphabetical character are unchanged and maintain the case sensitivity, right? That's the doc string of your project, but not the function. If you're adding a function like encode function, you need to write inside the function like, well, this encode function takes 2 inputs. One is like maybe the message and the shift value or the direction forward or backward, 3 actually input, and it returns a cipher, right? So that if I would like to use your function encode, then with the help function, I can easily see what you have written. So now for the program structure, make sure you follow these things. So for the program structure, it should start with a doc string. Then if you need to import something, have you imported anything for your project or for your assignment? Probably you did, like math library, right? Have you used like math.sqrt or what else? Probably you have used the sqrt or abs, the absolute value. That means the absolute value abs is a function from a math library, and math is a Python library. You need to import it. So if you need to import something, you need to put those import thing there. Then the third one is the utility function, like a user defined function that you have written. The utility function for your cases like encode and decode, you need to write those things. And finally, the main function. And what should be inside the main function? First, the inputs. You can use a different function to get the input, then the processing and the output. Maybe you need to print something there. You're only allowed to print inside the main function, not other functions, right? And the last thing is like main function calling. You can call just the main, but I'll show you a different way how you can call the main function with conditional execution. So this is the syntax. The syntax is if underscore underscore. So there is no gap between 2 underscore. So when I wrote these things, that's why like there is a space between those 2 underscore. But this is like underscore underscore name underscore underscore equal actually, not one equal. Then the double quote underscore underscore main underscore underscore colon. This is called like the main function with conditional execution. And what does that mean by those 3 things? First, you know the conditionals, right? The if. And what's the name and what's the main? Name is a variable. By default, whenever you're executing a Python script, it calls the name variable. And what it calls? It calls the module. Like you may have a lot of files, like 2 or 3 files. You have used the import, like import math, right? You can use the different module, which is like, for example, encode module. You can import that encode module to here. But there should be one main module. It will call the main module first. So whenever you are executing something, that should be inside the main module. But it's a lot of advanced thing. But I don't want you to go uh, like down to that particular concept. But what you can do, you can just memorize this syntax first. If underscore underscore name equal main. Later you'll understand what it is actually. But if you'd like to know more, you can just click this link and there's another link here. But I think for this class, you don't need to know these things. This is the advanced type of things. But this is basically called the main function with conditional execution. Now, if I can write a code, it could be like this. The first two lines are the docstring of the program, not the function, docstring of the program. Then importing library, for example, import math. Then I have some functions, def, like other function, whatever the function name I would like to use, the user defined function. Each function should have the function docstring. And then I have used the pass. Pass is called like a placeholder. If you're not writing the pass, then probably you'll have an error. It's because after the colon, they're expecting something. So if you're writing pass, that means there's something just passing this function. This is like a placeholder. Same thing for the main function. And what's inside the main function? Input, processing, output. And then finally the main function call. So this is like a structure when you start writing your code. Docstring of your program, if you need to import something. So that means this particular block is not under any, like this particular import is not under any block. That's why these lines are called global code. That's what I've mentioned, no global code. That means whenever you are writing any code, that should be either your user-defined function or your main function, or at least this if block, not outside any of those three. If anything outside of this should be only the import. This is called like a global code section. That means global code section is for all. Does that make sense? You follow this structure from next onward. Yes. Yes. But you can also import something inside a function. In that case, you are importing for that function. You cannot use that import to another function. They are in the local scope. That's why we're writing import as a global scope. Make sense? So from next onward, whenever you're submitting any assignment, any lab, any project, follow this structure. Write something about the project, author name, whatever the project name, assignment name, date, etc. If you import something, import there. Then write user-defined function first. Even if there is nothing there, just write the function name and the docstring and pass. Go down. Then write the main function, write pass, and then the conditional execution. Then start working from main. Inside the main, you have to get the input. So probably you can just get the input from the user like input function or some other ways. I will show you later. Next week, there is like command line, the input, but don't worry about this thing first. You can write another function to get the input, but it's okay. You need to write those things inside the main function. Then processing. For example, you'd like to add two numbers. Get the input first. Then for processing, you need to call another function like user-defined function. Then call those function inside the main block. Whatever you're getting from the main function, return through the return statement, print those things at the very end of the main function. As I told you, do not write print statement any other function except the main function. Any question? Okay. Now going back to types of parameter. So what is a parameter actually? By default, there is nothing, right? You can write a function with just parentheses. That means there is no parameter. If you're adding some parameter, make sure you have the same number of parameter when you're calling the function. But defining the function parameter are different ways. The very traditional way is like positional argument. That means if you have like 3 arguments, you need to write 3 parameters in the function header. They should be in order. That means if you have like 4 parameters or 5 parameters, you must know the order. Otherwise, you missed it. So just write a very simple function. Like I would like to write a function like sub function. I'm just writing B and A, as I know B is the bigger number, and return B minus A. And here is my A and B. When I'm calling the sub function, if I'm putting this A and B, this A will map with B, B will map with A. We'll have a different number, but we're expecting maybe like higher number to lower number subtraction. But here, changing the order will give you the different result. Or maybe if it is like a divide function, I'm checking B minus A, and I know A is the denominator. I'll check if A is equal 0, return, what's the return? Return probably a message like error. Now, if you're writing a diff function in this way, I know denominator is 0, but in that case, if I am writing the upper one 0, then I have a mismatch number. We cannot check these things. So position is really important. If you have multiple items, make sure you know the position. That's why it is important here to write the comment, the docstring. Like this function takes two inputs, B and A, where it treats A as a denominator. Then if there's an error, I can easily see, well, in that function, they're using B and A, not A and B. Now, sometimes it is hard for us to remember the order, right? If it is like 4, 5, or 6 parameter, it is really tough for us to remember. In that particular case, we can use the keyword. In that case, we don't need to maintain the order. We know the keyword. So what I can do here, I can write operand 1 and operand 2. Operand 1 is A, operand 2 is B. Okay. In that way, I'm writing a keyword like a named parameter. Instead of A and B, I'm writing A is the operand 1, B is the operand 2. Here, I don't need to follow the order. I can write operand 2 is 10 and operand 1 is 0. Or I can switch the order. It doesn't matter, as because I am writing the name. That means whenever it finds the operand 1, it will map the 10 with B, 0 with A. It will match operand 1 and operand 1. Right? So this is called like keyword parameter or named parameter. But can we add both, like positional and keyword? Let me go to the variation. What's the variations? So the first is the positional. You need to follow the position, first name, then message. So if you're sending other way, that means you're changing the order. The second one I told about the named parameter. So I don't need to remember the order, but I can use a named value here. So message is hi, name is Carol. So if the name come first, message come later, it doesn't matter. The third way is like a default parameter. Sometimes we don't need to check some values like, well, I know the default message is like hello, unless it is like hi or hola or bonjour or whatever the other language they have. By default, it is like hello. So what I can do, I can write a default parameter like this way. The message is hello. If you are not writing for the second parameter, by default, it will print hello. But you can overwrite it. If you're overwriting it, it will overwrite with the hello. So you can write here like bonjour. It will overwrite to the bonjour with the hello. So this is called like a default parameter. Whenever you're writing equal sign, so what I wrote here is not the actual things. What I wrote here is the default parameter. So default parameter is like you need to write the name and some value. The value is like hello. And make sure when you use the default parameter, those should be in the right side. You cannot write the default parameter first and the positional parameter later. Why? The reason is whenever you're writing the positional parameter, it will try to map with one position by another position. If there's the default one, it will mismatch the position. They don't know how many defaults are there. It will try to match, for example, the first one. It will try to match with the first one, name. Fine. Then default, there is nothing here, so put the default one. But what about the message first and name later? So if you're putting Bob, it will overwrite to the message. Then what's the value of name? There's nothing in the name. So that's why while you're writing a default parameter, those should be in the very last. There can be multiple, but after completing the positional one. First the positional, then the default. And there's some merits and demerits here. So here's the order matter. For the default, make function more flexible, reduce the number of required argument. And for the keyword, improves the readability, prevents the mistake caused by the incorrect ordering. Now, I told you that you need to scale your code. You need to scale your function. Sometimes you never know how many inputs are you expecting. For example, like you're writing a function called like add that can add 2 numbers, 3 numbers, 5 numbers, million numbers. You never know how many inputs the user can enter. In that particular case, you can use a variable positional argument. That means it is a variable as well. If it is a 2, you'll map with 2. If it is a 5, map with 5. It is a 1, just 1. So how it works? So traditionally, we use the asterisk signs and ARGS. But ARGS is like a convention so that anyone can see it's the variable naming argument. But you can change the variable name to different one. ARGS is the convention, but asterisk is the syntax. One is the syntax, another is the convention. Then you can find this way like, well, if there's like 1 to 3, it will definitely, if there's a multiple things, you need to loop it. You need to loop those numbers and print 1 by 1. If it is a true, 2 numbers, it will print 2. Like I'm writing a function here, for example, like an add function. And I have a variable name argument, args. And what I'm going to do here, I need to iterate the number in the args. And I have to have some values here, like the result is 0 initially. And then every time I'm increment by result with the number, not increment like adding. And finally, after the for, return the result. Now, when I'm calling the add function, result 1, 1, 2, 3, it will print 6. And when I'm calling add function to just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it will print 5 multiply 5 by 2, 60, 15, right? $21, not 15. 15 plus 6, 21. So this is called like scalable code. You are writing one function that contains different types of input. So again, this is a positional things. You can also use a keyword argument, like named argument, variable named argument. And again, the convention is writing keyword KW args so that it make more sense. This is not the arguments. This is like positional argument. This is the named argument. In that case, you need to use two asterisks. So two asterisks, then the variable name. But whenever you're printing those things, it will probably print the name of the position, name of the argument, not the value. But we can find the value in a different way, but we need to discuss these things while we're discussing the dictionary. So right now we're not discussing dictionary, but I can show you that we can also find the argument name and their values by just writing this way. So was that dictionary? Okay, yeah. So there are a lot of things they are interrelated, but that's why I'd like to say, like, don't waste too much time about the dictionary things here. This is the very basic things, how you can access one item in the dictionary, but I'll discuss those things later. So what I'm going to say here, like, you cannot only access the variable name, but the variable values as well. So both are okay. Now there are other two types of arguments, which is like keyword only or positional only. So only means like you are forcing them to put the keyword only argument. And then you can force them to use the positional argument there. So to force them for the keyword, start with asterisks. Like the first parameter is a positional, then asterisks, then afterwards are the keyword only. So you need to write the keyword there. Same thing for the positional. First one can be keyword or anything, then forward slash, then the positional. But don't worry, there are like too much things here. Probably we're not using those type of argument passing while we're writing the function. First, we try with the positional argument, then we'll try with the keyword, like named argument, and probably we'll be using variable naming things, like variable argument. It could be variable positional argument or variable naming argument, but not a mixture of keyword and positional. But if you need to write those things, probably you need to follow this order. What is the order? First, the positional only, then the positional. Then for the keyword, keyword and keyword only. So this is the order. But there's like two advanced things for writing a function in this case. So probably we'll be writing only the positional. If you don't remember the argument name, probably you need to write a named parameter, like the named argument. Sometimes we need to scale our code. In that case, we need to use a variable positional argument. And again, if we don't remember, probably no, as because we are not covering the dictionary here. So probably we are not using variable keyword argument here. So variable naming argument is fine. Just three. And also the default one. Default is really important. Sometimes we don't need to put too much information, like, for example, like is divisible. We're so sure it is divisible. If it is not, probably we need to write a different way. Like, for example, I need to write a code here. Def is divisible. I'm writing here number and divisor, and what can be a number? Or maybe I can write a function called like add num1 and num2 is 0. So return num1 plus num2. So while I'm calling the function add, I could put one value or I can put two values there. So when I'm calling this function, for the first one, by default, it takes, like it maps num1 to 1 and num2 is 0. That means 1 and 0 is 1, the same number. If it is multiple, like two numbers, then the second one will replace the 0. That means 1 plus 2 is 3. Sometimes we need to write some true false things by default, like we can assume, for example, like a while case. By default, it's a true, then we can break from the while. So I'll show you later with some example when we need to use the default parameter. But yeah, for this class, probably you need to use 4 types of parameters. First, the positional, default, then naming or keyword argument, then variable positional, probably variable naming, but not too much. Those are the 4 or 5 types we'll be using. Okay. Any question about the different types of arguments? No? Okay. I already have discussed the docstring. The docstring is like documentation of the string. You can get the help with the help function to know what's the documentation. There are various things in function, but probably we'll be covering those things in next class. But one thing I'd like to cover here is like we can call a function inside a function. That what we have done for our greet message, right? In the greet, we're calling make function. We're calling a function within a function. Whenever we're calling a function within a function, so this is our greet function. We're calling a function, make function from that function. It is possible, or the vice versa. We can call the greet function from here as well, but depending on our scenario. In that particular case, when we're calling function within a function, make sure we